Can I thank the anti-fascist people that are here tonight, that have given me time to come and to make sure that everything is going to be okay for the rest of us. Thank you very much. Now, the type of democracy we have in this country was not given to us, as you know, by someone with a magic wand, but it was hard fought for at least the last 200 years. And ever since its formation, the Communist Party has been part of the struggle for the democracy and is proud to be standing in this election to give people the opportunity to vote for a socialist. The Communist Party has more right to be standing in this election than the ruling class has. And the reason I say that is because the ruling class has challenged every meaningful move that the working class has made towards the democratic system. And if I just read out some of these to you, you'll understand what the ruling class were doing when the working classes were trying to advance themselves. And I'll just read them out. The Peterloo Massacre, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, the Chartist Movement, the Merthyr Rising with Dick Penderyn, the Pentonville Five, the Shrewsbury Pickets, and the Miners' Strike. Now you'll understand what I'm getting at when I read those out. Of course, the democracy we've got now is still capitalist democracy. And while other parties are happy with that and are willing to work within that framework, the Communist Party wants socialism. They want to expand the democracy we have to the extent of eradicating capitalism and establishing socialism for peace, for emancipation of the working class, where those according to their abilities and then according to their needs will be catered for. Under real socialism, there will be two exchanges that won't be required in this country. The one exchange is the labour exchange, and the other exchange is the stock exchange. So come May the 10th, let's not waste our vote. Let's vote communist and send a socialist to Parliament. So I thank you all for coming, and I'm going to call on the first speaker now, who is the candidate for Merthyr Tydfil, Robert Griffiths. Robert, okay?
Okay, thanks very much.
Bravo.
Tommy mentioned the Chartists and the Merthyr Rising of 1831, and I'd like to make it very clear from the beginning that I'm proud to stand in the tradition, not only of the Chartists, but of the physical force Chartists as well as the moral force Chartists, of those who realised that the ruling class in Britain rarely, if ever, concedes any significant reforms or advances for the working class unless and until they're forced to do so. I'm also proud to stand in the tradition of the Scotch cattle, who were particularly active in the Rumney Valley, at the top end of the Rumney Valley, which is also part of this Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney constituency, who were an early form of trade unionism. You could say almost the paramilitary form, the paramilitary wing of early trade unionism. They enforced solidarity, which was so necessary in order to take on ruthless ironmasters and coal barons. I'm proud to stand in the tradition as well of Henry Richard, the Apostle of Peace, a member of Parliament for Merthyr Tydfil. Of course, you could look through his record and say, well, he had certain illusions that our rulers would help to bring about a new international system, a new world order based on peace and social justice and so on. Perhaps a little naive, but nevertheless, somebody who campaigned tirelessly and had a reputation across Europe for proposing that countries should settle disputes peacefully and not have recourse, and usually as a first step, not have recourse to military force. I'm very proud to stand in the tradition of Keir Hardie, one of the very first Labour MPs, of course, and again an MP for this constituency. Although I must say I would consider myself to be in the tradition of the real Keir Hardie, not the Keir Hardie who has been turned into some kind of kindly old uncle who presided over the birth of the Labour Party, preaching sweetness and light everywhere. Keir Hardie was a firebrand. He opposed the ruling class in Britain, root and branch, including the monarchy. He was not very polite about them at all, by the way, and got thrown out of Parliament more than once for what he had to say about the enormous gulf between the rich and the poor in South Wales, in Merthyr Tydfil, and in Britain. And I'm very proud, of course, to stand in the tradition of S.O. Davies, the Member of Parliament for Merthyr Tydfil from 1934 to 1972. He still holds the world record for the number of times to be expelled from the Parliamentary Labour Party. Not even George could beat this. Expelled 5 times for defying the Labour whips in defence of peace, in defence of the first attempts, and only the first attempts, to build alternative socialist societies in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Expelled for opposing anti-working class policies from his own Labour government. And in many ways, one of the very few Labour MPs, I'm sad to say, that I've ever felt it was worth writing the biography of. In the course of researching that biography, I spent many days and weeks in Merthyr Tydfil and met many of the people who knew S.O., had long discussions with his widow, and of course it was, I suppose, fitting that in the end he had to contest the 1970 general election as an independent socialist. He'd already said, after the Merthyr Borough Council had handed the freedom of the borough to Harold Wilson and to George Thomas, after they had handed over money from the Aberfan Disaster Fund to the National Coal Board so that they could clear the tips, when he was offered the freedom of the borough, he said, "I don't want any kind of award that you would give to people like that." So he had to fight the 1970 general election as an independent socialist and won it with a majority of around 10,000 votes. I see that very much in the tradition of Merthyr Tydfil, the socialist and working class tradition of Merthyr Tydfil and the Rhymney Valley. There's somebody else I'd also like to say I hope I stand in the tradition of, and he was from Dowlais, and that was Professor Gwynalf Williams, possibly certainly one of the greatest historians that Wales has produced in the 20th century. And Gwyn left us so many terrific books and television programmes, drama documentaries and the like. Probably Gwyn, more than anybody else, rescued the Merthyr Rising from all those previous historians who had tried to dismiss it or condemn it as simply some kind of mindless riot. And Gwyn researched and wrote that terrific book on the Merthyr Rising, made great television programmes and so on. For long parts of his life he was in the Communist Party, but he did have a habit of falling out with just about everybody from time to time, so you could never be quite sure when he was in and when he was out. But what a tremendous legacy he gave us. And I just want to share one of my favourite moments from the many drama documentaries that he made, which again I think sums up the spirit, sums up the revolutionary traditions of this constituency. In one programme, Gwyn recalled as a young man, as I say, growing up in Dowlais, he recalled going to a public meeting to urge support for the international brigades fighting fascism in Spain. And he said after the speeches, which were so inspiring, the crowd sang the Internationale, and even the copper who'd been sent to spy on the meeting joined in, clenched fist and all. And Gwyn said, I was inspired. I rushed down to the Communist Party offices the next day, went in through the door, approached the counter. Now, Gwyn, of course, was 5'0" in his socks. He said, I approached the counter, I looked up and I said, give me a gun, send me to Spain, I want to join the International Brigades. And he said, the head looked over the top of the counter, looked down on him and said, son, come back when we're desperate. So many of the things that Gwyn Williams fought for and S.O. Davis fought for and Keir Hardie fought for and the Chartists and the Scotch cattle, so many even of the victories that have been won from time to time are still battles that we need to fight all over again and win all over again. Because one of the lessons of history is that whenever the capitalist class, whenever the ruling class in Britain sees an opportunity and is strong enough to claw back any of the gains that the working class has ever won, that is what they will do. And so today, we still have to fight for a much more profoundly democratic society. We still have to fight for a progressive taxation system. We still have to fight to defend, to desperately hang on to the public services that we've created. We have to fight for the public ownership all over again, perhaps in a different and better way, but the public ownership of the basic utilities, gas, electricity, water, for public transport, for the railways. We have to fight those battles all over again because we've won them in the past and we've been thrown back. We have to fight against the anarchy of the capitalist system. The anarchy which, by the way, they now call it market forces and free enterprise and all the rest of it. The anarchy which, if it had had its way, would have meant there would be no meeting here in Merthyr Tydfil, because Merthyr Tydfil quite literally would have ceased to have existed. In the 1930s, when Merthyr was so desperately afflicted by the capitalist depression, because that's what it was, the capitalist depression, it was seriously proposed by government-funded think tanks. It was supported in private by the king. It was seriously proposed that the town of Merthyr Tydfil should be closed down, and the population moved either to the banks of the River Usk, that's what the Political and Economic Planning Unit proposed, or as the king proposed, to a province in Canada. That's what market forces would have done to Merthyr Tydfil if people like S.O. Davis hadn't have risen up and said no. And, to its credit, if the Labour government of 1945 to 51 hadn't at least have tried to impose some element of planning, some element of public ownership and direction of capital, enough to ensure that a number of major companies were more or less compelled to establish themselves in Merthyr and create thousands of jobs for local people. That didn't come about by accident. That didn't come about because of market forces. It came about because of government intervention, state planning, backed up by public money. We still have to fight for a cause that was very dear to S.O. Davis's heart, and Keir Hardie, and Henry Richard, for that matter, a real parliament for Wales, with full lawmaking and revenue-raising powers. A parliament that can give real expression. I'm not saying we'll bring about socialism through parliamentary means, but parliaments can bring about reforms that can help change the balance of forces. A parliament in Wales that would more accurately reflect the progressive aspirations and desires and the needs of the people of Wales. That's why, by the way, I was proud of the role that communists played, supporting the terrific campaign that George waged during the recent referendum in Scotland, putting the case neither for unionism nor for nationalism, but for progressive federalism, an independent, working-class, progressive, left-wing policy that maintains the unity that we've built up across the Labour movement, across the three nations of Britain, whilst also recognising the specific national identities and aspirations of its constituent nations by having full federal parliaments within a federal Britain. And we still have to win that position. And of course, above all, and I'm not even going to compete with George's thunder on this, of course, the struggle for peace continues. I don't know about all of the other candidates in this election, and I would be delighted if the Labour candidate, who I understand is a pretty decent kind of fella, I would be delighted if the Labour candidate would prove my suspicions wrong and give a commitment in this election campaign that he will oppose the waste of £100 billion of public money buying another generation of weapons of mass destruction to renew or replace the Trident nuclear submarine system. And I made the point at the last meeting that George was not able to attend, and I make no apologies for saying it again. Can there be any circumstances whatsoever under which we would unleash nuclear weapons with the deliberate intention of killing hundreds of thousands, at the minimum, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people on the other side of the world because their government had done something against us? Can there ever be any justification for the mass murder of civilians? Of course there can't. There would be no circumstances, absolutely no circumstances, that could ever justify the use of nuclear weapons. Now I wonder, I hope, the Labour candidate would be prepared to say he will be one of those in the next Parliament, alongside George, alongside Kelvin Hopkins, alongside Jeremy Corbyn, who we had here just a few months ago, who would have the courage to show two fingers to the whips and say, I will never be an accomplice to the mass murder of civilians. Because that's what it boils down to. Let's see. If you want an MP, who, by the way, will be very clear from the very beginning, opposed to all nuclear weapons, I'm not a pacifist, some causes have to be fought for. And sometimes that's what justice requires. But if you want an MP who will never support the possession or use of nuclear weapons, then I believe you'll need to vote Communist. I don't think you'll get one by voting Labour. So the struggle for peace goes on. The struggle for international nuclear disarmament, but that's a struggle in which Britain and other countries could take the initiative, just like South Africa did. Just like Ukraine, under its overthrown leader, deposed by a Western-backed coup, did. Abandon nuclear weapons unilaterally. Ukraine and South Africa, the only countries to have done so far. What's happened to them as a result? Well, they haven't been destroyed. Nobody's attacked them. They've saved tens of billions of pounds that could be spent on health and education and public services and so on. So, comrades, I'm not going to speak for much longer. I felt obliged to speak at quite some length at the last meeting, so you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to speak for very much longer. I'm just going to finish on this one note. In this constituency, of course, Labour start off as the favourites. As I say, my understanding is the Labour candidate is a decent person, committed to serving the people of his ward and the people of the Rumney Valley and so on. But do we need yet another South Wales Labour MP? With all of the tremendous traditions of resistance and struggle that we have here in South Wales, why is it that we send so many Labour MPs to Westminster who just tamely carry out whatever the whips tell them to do? They'll vote for privatisation. They'll vote for nuclear weapons. They'll vote for war. They'll vote against public ownership. They'll vote against the repeal of anti-trade union laws. Is that really what we want? Or do we want MPs who are socialists, who tell you what they believe and say vote for it or don't vote for it, but that's what you'll get. You'll get a socialist MP who's against anti-trade union laws, who believes in taxing the rich and big business when they own so much of the wealth that's produced by ordinary people. A socialist MP who supports a federal parliament for Wales. A socialist MP who believes in public ownership, not only of the utilities and public transport, but of other key sectors of the economy. A socialist MP who believes in economic planning, the only approach that saved the very existence of Merthyr Tydfil and other towns and villages in South Wales. If you want that kind of MP, then I hope you'll vote Communist. Otherwise, I'm afraid, instead of making what would be worldwide news on May the 8th and having a Communist MP, Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney will be just one more South Wales constituency that sends just yet one more Labour MP to the House of Commons, not an S.O. Davis, I'm afraid, not a Keir Hardie, but an MP who will simply carry out all of the new Labourite and semi-new Labourite policies that I suspect we will read in the Labour Party election address. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. When you were talking about S.O. Davis, I was told a story by his daughter and his son, and they say it's definitely true. But when we had the much-loved Arthur Jones, councillor, probably the most loved councillor that this town has had in many, many years, when he put in for a job in Rivers and he was refused, apparently S.O. Davis refused to go to the opening ceremony and sit with all the bigwigs because he said, you wouldn't give a job to one of my friends. And that's what S.O. Davis was like. And I know that Robert Griffiths would be the same kind of person. Now, I told you that George Galloway has come all the way from Bradford tonight, and he's going all the way back to Bradford tonight. Some travelling. But I think you'll remember him travelling to America. You saw it on TV, I suppose. And saw him travel to America. And, well, put down, really, a senator or whatever he was. He was a chairman of some committee. They thought that there was somebody coming in there that they could boss about, like they probably do to the Prime Minister. But unfortunately, they found out that George Galloway isn't that type of person. But anyway, that's enough from me. I'm now going to introduce you to George Galloway.
Thank you.